I live alone in a 500 square foot apartment, which is honestly much more space than what I need. I mean, as a person who spends most of their time sitting in a chair and staring at computer monitors, I just don't take up much space, and it isn't like I'm having guests over. In fact, I try to avoid human interaction by doing laundry on Tuesday, buying food at 7 a.m. or 9 p.m., and checking both sides of the street to make sure that there are no cars whatsoever before I cross. Of course, that isn't to say that my social life is non-existent. I DM games of Dungeons & Dragons for a few of my friends, visit my parents every week, and work in retail. And sure, that's not much, but it's something, and I'm very happy to have them. Except for the job, I only do that to pay the bills. That said, if these small interactions were to be removed from my life, I would largely resemble the protagonist of Welcome to the N.H.K, a shut-in who secludes himself from the entire world. But then, this makes me wonder, why would anyone choose to live like that, and what can we learn from them? After all, despite how my introversion pushes me to not be around people, becoming a shut-in is one of the last things I want to do. As such, while I delved into Welcome to the N.H.K for the sake of making a video about it, I focused on dissecting the actions and thoughts of the story's titular character. However, despite the dark atmosphere of the anime, I discovered a message about why you should never give up, and that while humans often seek meaning through their accomplishments, true meaning can only be found in genuine human connection. Welcome to Labra Stories. This video contains spoilers for large parts of Welcome to the N.H.K. That said, the anime is also 17 years old at this point, so that warning might not be necessary. Nevertheless, it is worth noting that again, since I'm discussing a dark anime, this video has trigger warnings for substance abuse, severe anxiety, and suicide. Do with that as you will, but if you're still along for the ride, let's discuss how someone might go about escaping the N.H.K. One hot and muggy summer day, Sato Tatsuhiro, a freshman attending a university in Tokyo, is headed to his class when he suddenly begins to feel like everyone he passes is judging him, thinking that he's gross, somehow embarrassing, and that his very existence in the outside world is a nuisance. As for what caused these sudden intrusive thoughts is never specified, but given his status as a student, it's not too hard to guess what happened. He could have failed an important test, had poor grades in general, was rejected by a friend group, or never found any friends to begin with. Perhaps the heat just made something in his brain snap, but in any case, overcome with this sensation, Sato runs back to his apartment, after which he then spends the next 3 years of his life as a hikikomori. Now, for those of you who don't know what that is, hikikomori is a form of social withdrawal, with the term applying to both the behavior and the individuals that exhibit the following traits. Spends most of their time at home, has no interest for and no participation in school or working, the withdrawal lasts for a period of at least 6 months, does not have schizophrenia, an intellectual disability and/or bipolar disorder, and does not maintain any personal relationships. Now, as hikikomori is a behavioral phenomenon, it is unclear as to what triggers it, although the theory that Welcome to the N.H.K follows is that after failing to meet expectations, individuals suffer from feelings of rejection, followed by a desire to disappear from scrutiny due to lacking a sense of belonging or for fear of being ridiculed. As evidence of this, the vast majority of reported cases of hikikomori begin after some form of social or academic failure, which we've observed to be the case for Sato. Additionally, it is also observable that with the vast amounts of free time this isolation grants, hikikomori engage themselves to the pursuit of a hobby, but it's at this point that Sato breaks from that typical hikikomori mold because he doesn't actually have a hobby. To illustrate, let's take a look at his room, wherein we can see that Sato has a large number of books, a television, computer, a variety of magazines spread across the floor, and alongside an overflowing ashtray are an equally abundant amount of empty cans, most of which are probably alcoholic. But despite owning these objects, Sato isn't too interested in them, as he purportedly spends 16 hours a day sleeping, or more accurately, lapsing in and out of consciousness between naps. Which is odd. I mean, I can only see Sato's life as being incredibly miserable. Other than visiting the park by his apartment on late Sunday nights, Sato's only outside excursion is to the local convenience store, whose limited meal options he has likely eaten several, if not hundreds of times. Additionally, given that he hasn't been paying his electric bill recently, it's likely that money is pretty tight, bringing into question how much he's actually able to use the television and computer, as well as why Sato buys a fair amount of addictive substances. Sure, given that he isn't likely to clean his room, it's unclear how long the mess has been stacking up, but it's still true that there are some hobbies that Sato could be doing that not only would be constructive, but also cheaper than what he's currently engaging in. Writing, drawing, maybe even knitting. So then, why does Sato spend so much time in limbo? Well, to explain, let's go back to when Sato was attending high school, during which he happened to meet an eccentric girl by the name Sawashimi Hitomi. As the only two members of the literature club, the two spent a great deal of time together, although they didn't actually do much other than playing cards, while Hitomi talked about her favorite subject, conspiracies. Now, to Sato's credit, he does point out that most conspiracies are made up mumbo-jumbo, often served alongside a glass of malicious intent. That said, not all conspiracies are created equally, and as time passes, it is revealed that some of them are actually real. That small 1% of conspiracies that were created by gigantic powers, conducted by secret agents, and covered up so well that nearly no evidence remained. However, that means that anything could be part of a conspiracy, and so perhaps everything is part of a conspiracy. Now, as of the present, this is exactly what Sato has come to believe. As explained by his appliances during a drug-induced hallucination, Sato has become one of the very few victims of a real conspiracy called the N.H.K, standing for Nihon Hikikomori Kyokai, an organization which aims to selectively turn various members of Japanese society into hikikomori. Now, while the specifics of how the N.H.K chooses its targets, how they operate, and how they create hikikomori are obviously vague, the specifics aren't really important. In fact, it's likely that because Sato has no conceptualization of why or how this has happened to him, that he is able to believe that any event in his life could have been manufactured to get him to where he is now. That time he got beaten up at school, his dwindling funds, the student council president yelling at him, the endlessly repeating music that comes from his neighbor, or even the animated television shows that appeal to the otaku audience. Maybe even just a random passerby on the street is an agent of the N.H.K. Of course, this is irrational, but Sato is willing to believe in the N.H.K because if his failure has been manufactured by this exterior entity, then it isn't his fault that he's a hikikomori. As such, he's in denial, unwilling to come to terms with the reality that he's responsible for ending up in his position, and as an extension, Sato has simply taken up substance abuse to keep his mind dulled. After all, it's easier to ignore reality when your brain isn't fully functional, but that also isn't to say that Sato lacks the capacity to rationalize his position. For example, upon hearing a knock at his door, Sato panics thinking that it might be the electric company coming to collect, and ends up answering it. Of course, it isn't the electric company, but rather a young girl and her aunt doing door-to-door proselyting for a very on-the-nose hikikomori-centered program. A complete coincidence to be sure, but that doesn't stop Sato from attempting to convince them that he couldn't possibly be a shut-in. Unsurprisingly, he fails to do so, what not with his awkward manner of speaking and the fact that he almost ends up just admitting the truth. That said, Sato is unwilling to actually admit that to himself, forcing him to move on to Plan B, although the logic of how this plan works is insane. So, to set the foundation, the reason Sato has secluded himself is that he wants to avoid being ridiculed for his failures. However, Sato can only comfortably remain in this state for as long as he believes that nobody is aware that he's a hikikomori, because that would be another source of ridicule. As such, it is imperative that Sato doesn't appear to be a hikikomori, and the only way that he sees to do that is to get a job. But this isn't getting a job so that he won't be a hikikomori anymore, it's to convince two strangers that Sato isn't in a deplorable state, so that he can then continue to live in that state. So then, with this reasoning, Sato gets dressed and heads out to apply for a job at a nearby manga cafe. Unfortunately, upon entering, Sato finds that the same young girl is at the desk, and all of his plans go out the window. He can't apply here because then she would know he doesn't have a job, and so instead, he awkwardly starts talking about bikes, stops abruptly, and then leaves. That said, Sato does get a second chance because as it turns out the young girl, Nakahara Misaki, has decided to, as she puts it, save Sato, but not in the religious sense. In fact, her reason for doing this isn't going to be addressed within this video and also remains unknown for the majority of the anime, so suffice to say that Misaki wants to end Sato's hikikomori lifestyle, and she's incredibly insistent on doing so. I mean, she gets Sato to meet her at the nearby park and even draws up an entire contract for pseudotherapy sessions with a $10,000 fine for not showing up. Of course, Sato isn't very cooperative, and instead of signing the contract, he reattempts to convince Misaki that he isn't a hikikomori. In fact, he's actually a creator of video games, but unsatisfied with this claim, Misaki asks Sato to prove it, and as Sato soon realizes, he's completely incapable of doing so. Now, that's not going to stop him from trying. After all, Sato is convinced that he has to do so in order to not be seen as a failure. However, his pursuits ultimately lead nowhere. After all, Sato's motivation isn't to end his hikikomori behavior, and instead he's attempting to generate an illusion to suit the justifications of his denial. As a result, this puts Sato into a state of cognitive dissonance wherein he wants to appear successful in some way without having to do any of the work needed to actually be like that, hence leading to a lack of progress. To demonstrate, while making a sound complaint to whoever's blasting music from the other side of the wall, Sato discovers that his neighbor is Yamazaki, another one of his friends from high school. Additionally, as it turns out, Yamazaki is attending a vocational school with the hopes of being able to create a video game of his own, and so with their goals aligned, the two pair up. The only problem is that with their lack of experience and budget, Sato isn't sure if they can make anything, although Yamazaki suggests that there is one type of game that anyone could make under such constraints: eroge. It's incredibly easy to make, and as Yamazaki claims, just doing so will set off a series of dominoes, resulting them in owning a multi-billion-dollar corporation. Of course, this is outrageously unrealistic, but it nevertheless succeeds in convincing Sato to go along with the plan. As such, to teach Sato the basics of how eroge work, Yamazaki lends Sato several of his video games to play through. However, this doesn't result in Sato working on the game, as he instead blows through a week of progress and becomes addicted. Afterwards, Yamazaki reminds Sato that they need to make the game, and to aid in giving Sato some inspiration, Yamazaki hands over his secret collection. Unfortunately, this only causes Sato to further regress into degeneracy, completely filling his computer with pornographic images, and then needing to be brought back to reality by Yamazaki once again. But despite this, Sato still fails to come to terms with himself, as he claims that he's only done all of this for the sake of inspiration to work on the game, directly juxtaposed to him uncontrollably jumping to take a panty shot when a strong breeze passes by. Justification after justification, and for as long as Sato feels the need to justify his actions, he isn't going to improve because he isn't capable of viewing himself realistically. However, if we look at this from a different angle, Sato keeps making these justifications because he doesn't feel safe confiding in his peers. He thinks that if he ever lets the facade slip and opens up, then in return, Yamazaki, Misaki, or whoever will just roast him alive. So then, what would happen if he were placed in a more understanding environment? Well, after Yamazaki once more tries to get Sato to work on the game by dragging him all the way to Akihabara, Sato happens to run into Hitomi, that girl from the literature club. The two have dinner together, and after some reflecting on how Hitomi is on far too many prescriptions, Hitomi asks Sato what he's been doing recently. Now, when asked this question by Misaki or Yamazaki, Sato's immediate reaction was to deny his lifestyle, respectively claiming that he was a creator or still attending college. But with Hitomi, he doesn't do this at all. Instead, he immediately admits that he's a hikikomori and puts on display all the merchandise that he had just purchased with little regard to how he will be viewed. After all, it's not really Sato's fault that he's this way. It's all just part of a conspiracy, and if there's anyone in the world that Sato is sure isn't part of the N.H.K, it's Hitomi. After all, she's the very person who first introduced him to the concept, the one person he can trust to not ridicule him because she sees the world just like he does. However, before the two part ways, Sato asks if they might be able to meet again in the future, but unfortunately, Hitomi isn't so willing to oblige as she looks at Sato with a tinge of disgust and refuses because Sato is a hikikomori. But then, this doesn't make sense to Sato. He thought that as the only person he could trust that saw the world just like he did, surely Hitomi would be able to see that Sato was a victim, and yet she judges him. With this, Sato is given irrefutable evidence that he is unable to rationalize because the only possible conclusion is that he is in some ways at fault. And this is important because now that Sato is aware that he has a problem, his motivations to avoid ridicule do a 180, and rather than reinforcing his behavior, they now work to push Sato to improve. From this, it then follows that Sato signs the contract that Misaki gave him, mostly because she's the only person that's offered to help Sato. However, there is a problem in that this won't actually help. I mean, while Sato does deserve credit for starting counseling with Misaki, by no means should this counseling be considered high quality. Misaki is not a trained therapist, she's an 18-year-old with a few books on psychology and a lot of free time, so the counseling itself isn't going to give Sato the direction he needs. For example, at one point Misaki offers to resolve Sato's incapability to communicate by using something she has called the Copernican conversation. In essence, this technique poses that in order to combat the idea that everyone is endlessly judging you for every mistake you make, which then results in you making more mistakes, that you simply assume that whoever you're talking to is worse than you. To simplify, this is the common public speaking advice that you imagine the audience to be nothing more than potatoes, and as such, they have no ability to ridicule your mannerisms, choice of clothes, mumbly tone, nasally accent, or that what you're talking about is stupid and that you should just shut up. Anyways, the point is that as potatoes, your audience won't even be able to remember your speech, much less even observe it, and so there isn't anything to fret over because at the end of the day, it's all in your head. That said, it does raise the question of why you're speaking to a room full of potatoes. Now, on paper, this sounds good because it potentially allows Sato to be able to comfortably speak to anyone, but it isn't a real solution. Rather, it's like a barrel of crabs, wherein Sato would always be pulling others down in the hopes of escape, resulting in zero progress. And the reason for this is that it doesn't resolve the root cause of Sato's anxiety, which becomes clearer later in the episode. For context, Sato happens to hear that Yamazaki might have a girlfriend, and so he sets out to confirm the rumor by paying the vocational school a visit. While there, Sato incidentally ends up taking a lecture for game scenario writing, during which the instructor asks the class to create a proposal for a scenario they would like to write. While Sato does so, the teacher happens to read his proposal and gives off a small chuckle. In response to this, Sato covers his work, claiming that the teacher is judging him. He thinks the scenario is garbage, by implication that Sato is a terrible writer who should just give up. Of course, this isn't what the instructor was thinking at all, and as they go on to tell Sato, it isn't that they were judging him, and in fact it's the other way around because Sato isn't viewing his peers in good faith. Instead, he's interpreting any action that could be incriminating, no matter how small, as being an undeniable insult. However, as nobody is actually thinking this, it is clear that Sato's anxiety is a projection of how he views himself, a college dropout who now lives as a despicable parasite on society. Additionally, if we take this root cause and return it to Misaki's comment, it can be seen that this Copernican conversation is just putting up a facade. In fact, it's just like Sato's denial wherein he attempted to not appear as a hikikomori without actually removing that status. As such, Sato needs to act like, well, not a crab, and rather than blaming his surroundings for his state, he should work to improve himself to the point that he isn't in said state. However, an important aspect of this is that in Sato's quest to improve himself, the Copernican conversation initially seems like it will do just that. Hence, it is imperative that the proposed solutions be evaluated to see if they will actually be beneficial, or if they're just painting over a rotting board. It's like how Sato had to recognize that he had a problem in order to end his denial, and hence he has to learn what his problem is to resolve it. That said, even though the anime has now better explored Sato's dilemma, Sato still has to do the work to improve. After all, despite the writing instructor plainly spelling out Sato's problem, Sato fails to come to terms with it, instead becoming hyper-focused on the people around him. As a result, he has a panic attack, shouts about the N.H.K while running out of the class, and then secludes himself in his room for several days. Now, as I just said, Sato has to do the work to improve, although he's just entered a relapse, once more becoming a full-blown hikikomori. However, that doesn't mean he hasn't gotten better, even if Sato thinks otherwise. I mean, as Sato says, he's actually worse than when the story began. He doesn't answer the door, can't bring himself to check his phone, his only human interaction is when Yamazaki drops off food, and he wouldn't mind dying if it weren't such a hassle. But then, let's compare this to Sato over the course of events leading up to this point. After all, despite largely calling himself a hikikomori, he's gone out in public several times with varying levels of competence. Starting with the job attempt, Sato immediately broke down the moment he had to start talking to another person, but compare that to the excursions in Akihabara and Yamazaki's school. For the former, there are people everywhere, busy streets with nowhere to hide, and with the air being filled with blending conversations, it seems like the perfect storm to trigger anxiety, and yet there's no breakdown from Sato. Well, no obviously apparent one at least, rather Sato lights up a cigarette to relieve the stress, but while doing so, he honestly contemplates that a life outside might not be that bad. Next, while at the vocational school, it actually takes a long time for Sato's panic attack to occur, and until then, he acts normally with someone he's never met for several minutes. That's an improvement from his job interview attempt, and sure, it isn't massive, but nobody was expecting Sato to wake up as the definition of charisma. Additionally, with all of this analysis, we can now illustrate that the path for Sato to recover is exposure, or more specifically, CBT. No, not that one. Cognitive behavioral therapy, as it's known in the realm of psychology, is an action-oriented approach to several mental afflictions like depression, addiction, and of course anxiety by means of direct confrontation. However, this isn't just Sato going out to a public place and waiting for the stress to get to him. Rather, CBT focuses on identifying triggers and the subject's subsequent response to them in order to evaluate the reaction and then create a plan to better deal with such scenarios, which is what I've illustrated up to this point. Mostly. I mean, yes, it's important to recognize the triggers and their subsequent responses, but nevertheless, the process of resolving the problem is accomplished through repetition and practice. So then, with Sato's relapse, it's this process that I want to focus on. I mean, relapsing is a pretty common occurrence in any sort of recovery, and the sensation that not only do you have to start over, but that you're a failure for having to do so is overwhelming. Understandably, it's easy to see why someone would just give up, but in order to recover, it's incredibly important to recognize that progress was being made and that it can be done again. Additionally, nobody was expecting for the problem to be resolved instantly. It's a given that recovery is a long journey with dips in the road and hills to climb, but the only way to not reach the destination is to give up. So then, with all this, we now have the general mechanics of how Sato needs to recover. Touch grass, find out that you're allergic, seek immediate mental care, and then do it again. However, it's not actually clear what Sato's problem is. I mean, sure, I mentioned that Sato is projecting his senses of failure onto others, however, this is just one dimension of the problem. Fortunately, as Welcome to the N.H.K. continues, it will address this, although it's going to take a bit to get the whole picture, so let's just put a pin in the thought and take a step back from looking at Sato. After all, it's been a while since I've talked about Hitomi, so let's take a look at what she's up to. Hitomi has always been a hard worker, attending a good college, and as of the present, is working as a civil servant where she types up several page proposals for various issues she finds important. Unfortunately though, her efforts go unappreciated, as her proposals get rejected in favor of checking the registry for the third time, while her peers ridicule her for even trying. Additionally, Hitomi's love life isn't going well either. She's hooked up with Jogasaki, the chief programmer of some company, and while the two have made arrangements for a weekend trip, the day before their departure a critical error shows up in the code, and so Jogasaki has to cancel at the last minute. As a result, Hitomi's trust falters, concluding that Jogasaki doesn't really love her and is instead leading her along as part of a conspiracy. From this, Hitomi then resolves to join an offline meeting for a group suicide with 4 other attendants, the most of whom have in one way or another come to view their lives as being worthless. The first is an older man who owns both the island that the party has determined to be their final destination, as well as the boat that they take to get there. However, ever since the man got a divorce with his wife, he's come to view his material possessions as meaningless and concluded that life has nothing left to offer him. Next is the heir to a family hospital who was previously studying as a medical student, however after sneaking some drugs out, he got expelled. As a result, he's now banned from the practice and he can no longer carry on the family business, which he decided was his entire future. Third is a literal child who, after stealing a bunch of money from his parents to appease some ruffians, essentially ran away thinking that his parents would never accept him. And then we have Sato, who isn't going on this trip with the intent of suicide. Rather, after Hitomi got the news from Jogasaki, she called Sato asking if she could swing by his apartment, and once Sato figured out what had happened, he had decided that he might be able to become her new boyfriend, and by doing so escape his life as a hikikomori. Thus, in an attempt to get closer, Sato says that he will accompany Hitomi to wherever she wants to go, completely unaware of her plans. With this, once everyone arrives on the island, we have a dichotomy between the first 4 members, who are intending for this to be their last day on Earth, and the uncharacteristically positive Sato, who even after discovering the truth, remains adamant to survive. He tries to talk to everyone and cheer them up, and although they're unreceptive at first, they eventually join him in building a fire from driftwood. In fact, as they eat, drink, and connect with each other, the mood lightens, all because Sato didn't give up on his dream to restart his life. As such, the 3 men eventually realize that they're making a mistake, because while they may not currently be on the best of terms with their respective families, permanently severing that link isn't the solution. After all, they can still reach out, amend their mistakes, or start on something new to reform their bond, because if Sato, an actual no-life hikikomori, is making that attempt, then why shouldn't they? And of course, this is the same as what I said about relapsing, that the trio's shortcomings can only remain for as long as they give up. That said, while this conviction stops the three men from jumping, it isn't so easy for Hitomi, who is convinced that she has nobody left that cares for her, and that finding such a person will only lead to conspiracies. So, she jumps. Or at least, she would have if Jogasaki didn't show up in the nick of time to profess his love to her and give undeniable proof that there's someone that found value from being with her. And it's this part of Welcome to the N.H.K. about genuine human connection that I think is incredibly important. To illustrate, let's go all the way back to episode 1 with Sato alone in his room, doing absolutely nothing. Well, actually let's give him some hobbies, writing game scenarios, coding, what have you, but he won't show his creations to anyone, and nobody other than him will ever know that they exist. So then, does it matter that Sato does anything? Well, no, at least not from a nihilistic lens wherein even all of humanity becomes meaningless in regards to the expanses of space. Of course, that's far too broad of a perspective, but the principle still applies that if Sato's actions aren't going to have an effect, then they won't matter. Now, sure, Sato could do plenty of things to change himself. Train his body, train his brain, achieve enlightenment or something. However, again, nobody will ever know about that. In some ways, the Sato is essentially playing a single-player hardcore game of Minecraft. He can build a house, write a novel, explore the oceans and far-off dimensions, or whatever he may want to do, but inevitably the game ends. So then, did it matter? Well, kind of. As far as Minecraft is concerned, no. The data from the game is long gone, but to Sato, his accomplishments mattered quite a bit. But the thing is, this Minecraft hypothetical is exactly the same as when I compared all of humanity to the universe, just on different scales. As such, the hypothetical Sato and all of humanity become interchangeable, meaning that while the actions of the human race don't matter in regards to the whole of reality, they do matter to itself. Or I guess, to each other. Sharing memories, making something together, destroying something together, or any manner of experience. After all, upon feeling a loss of connection with their families, the offline meeting members concluded that as a single person they no longer mattered, and upon deciding to reattain connections, their sense of purpose was reignited. Of course, that isn't to say that human connection alone is enough, because it only serves as a conduit to give our experiences meaning. Hence, we must choose what experiences we will share, but in doing so we have a problem. And it's not that there are too many options to choose from. Rather, the problem is that depending on how one goes about it, making this decision can be detrimental. To illustrate, once the offline meeting members are brought back to the mainland, they thank Sato for saving them. The child specifically does so by giving Sato a free trial to the MMORPG titled Ultimate Fantasy, where he might be able to make some money with real money trading, or RMT, where a player obtains rare items in a game and then sells it to another player for real money. Coincidentally, this comes in handy almost immediately, because as soon as Sato returns home, his mother calls to inform him that his allowance will be cut in half. As such, Sato has to get a job so that he can afford food, and being unwilling to go outside, he dives into the online world to become the most legendary gamer to ever live. It doesn't go very well. In fact, it's disastrous, as Sato still avoids other players at every possible opportunity, forcing him to solo the multiplayer game, and he also just doesn't get how games work. Like, he goes and repeatedly gets killed by the same Wolfman monster instead of deciding to maybe go somewhere else and hunt low-level mobs. That said, Misaki gives the insight that focusing on the end goal without taking the steps to actually get to that goal isn't going to get you anywhere, and with this in mind, Sato eventually manages to gain a few levels. Additionally, after a few days, Sato runs into a catch-girl cleric named Mia, who after buttering Sato up becomes his first party member. However, as the days turn into weeks, Mia's praise for Sato continues as he becomes more enraptured by the game, while his appreciation for the real world dwindles. He stops shaving, his room fills up with trash, and even though the free trial period is long over, he hasn't made a single cent, much less found an item worth selling. That said, Mia does happen to find a group willing to help Sato hunt a dragon so that he can kickstart his business, although we never get to the point where he attempts to do so. Instead, Mia announces that they're so enamored with Sato that they want to meet him in the real world, after which Sato soon finds out that all along, Mia was actually Yamazaki. He literally catfished Sato. As Yamazaki explains, Sato has been royally fooled because the riches and lifestyle that Sato was seeking in the world of the game were never actually obtainable. or at least not for Sato. For starters, to actually make money off of RMT, you need to have a deep understanding of the game. Drop rates, spawn times, optimized builds, attack strategies, precise execution, having to adapt all of these factors with nearly every update, the willpower to repeat attempts ad nauseum, and above all, a team of like-minded individuals just to get the items. And then you still have to sell them. Of course, Sato lacks all of these, and so he will never succeed in RMT. And then we have Sato's second desire, in that he believed that his avatar, the powerful magic knight, could level up, slay dragons, and by doing so, acquire anything, even love. But that isn't going to happen either, because while Sato has recognized that beating the game is a sign of being powerful, he then sought to beat the game to get that power for the sake of finding a party that would accept him. However, ultimate fantasy cannot be beaten without teamwork, and as such, Sato has failed to follow Misaki's advice and ended up chasing the goal rather than following the steps to it. But taking another look at prior events, this isn't the first time this has happened. In fact, we can actually see this pattern all over the place. With Yamazaki's game proposal, he was entirely focused on the wealth and allure rather than how to actually make a good game. Misaki's Copernican conversation only emulated non-anxious conversations rather than removing the cause of anxiety. And of course, this is especially prevalent with Sato, who supposed in both his denial and hikikomori to avoid ridicule by chasing the goal of not being around the source of ridicule, rather than taking the steps to not be in a position that deserved that judgment. So then, bringing that pinned thought back, I noted that the exact workings of Sato's mind were unknown, but it is now clear that this pattern of putting the cart before the horse is Sato's problem in its simplest form. That said, even though we can see that Sato struggles to evaluate the cause and effect of his actions, I must ask why Sato can't see that for himself. I mean, humans are built to recognize patterns, but Sato jumps from denial to hikikomori and then to ultimate fantasy, none of which provide anything that Sato thought they would. Additionally, as of the next arc, Sato ends up getting involved in a multi-level marketing scheme, so it's pretty clear that he isn't getting the message. But then, why? There has to be a reason for Sato to continue this cycle, and I think the answer is that he actually believes that he's taking the preferable course of action. To explain, the average lifespan of the modern human is 72 years, but after removing an approximate 12 years of retirement and another 12 years of general dependence on parents, we are left with 48 years in which anyone will be able to work towards their general welfare. Earn money, stay healthy, learn, teach, experience, but then again, viewing life like this feels strange. That's not to say that nobody does, after all it's essentially long-term planning. However, as humans experience everything in the present, it's hard to reconcile our present emotions with logic about an unknown future. For example, logic dictates that if I want to take care of my health, then I should exercise, but I don't want to. Why would I want sore muscles? That's just painful, and the hour or two that I spent exerting myself could have been spent procrastinating. But it's not that I don't want to be the healthiest person I could be, just that I don't want to put in the necessary work. Additionally, even if I don't exercise, the alternative of sloth still leaves me in a comfortable position, as I'm already decently healthy. However, Sato isn't in this same position, because while he does recognize that he needs to do something to improve himself, he is also already in an active state of suffering. As such, both continuing in this state and working to escape it are less than emotionally gratifying ideas, making the prospect of an easy fix all the more alluring. A get-rich-quick scheme, a fake world in a box, or pure delusion. As long as Sato can be convinced that it will make him feel better, then he's likely to follow suit. Of course, as it's been thoroughly demonstrated, these are just goals that won't get you anywhere, but nevertheless, as this misguiding of Sato's pursuits is at the core of his motivations, it is also present in the events that led Sato to becoming a hikikomori. So, to wrap this up, let's go back to the beginning one last time. One hot and muggy summer day, Sato Tatsuhiro, a freshman attending a university in Tokyo, is headed to that very institution just like he would on any other day. However, unlike any other day, Sato feels like everyone he passes is judging him, thinking that he's gross, somehow embarrassing, and that his very existence in the outside world is a nuisance. And it's no wonder that Sato thinks this. After all, he's grown up being taught that he should get a good job, should get perfect grades, and should behave in a specific restrictive manner in order to have a good life. However, while Sato feels as such, the truth is that his failure is based on a warped perception. You see, in attending college, Sato is seeking after something he wants, be it a life full of accomplishments, wealth, or something else entirely, with each of these pursuits ultimately acting as a sign that Sato is successful, which Sato believes will then give his life meaning. However, this simply isn't the case. I mean, what even is success given that the ultimate end is death? Having a large bank account isn't going to matter after that, nor will anything that Sato obtained. Hence, accomplishments aren't going to bring meaning to his life because on their own they have no effect on the universe, and as such, you need a conduit or vehicle. It's like a horse drawing a cart to market. The goods enrich the trip that is being made, however they will serve no purpose without a means to travel. As such, relating this to the current situation, while success is the cart, the horse is being able to share one's life through human connections because we're the only part of this universe that cares about us. But of course, Sato has placed the cart before the horse, and for as long as Sato has the idea that his academic performance will bring validation, he will not be able to obtain that. Nevertheless, as we watch Sato go through his journey of coming across this pattern again and again, by the end of it he realizes that he's been following this line of reasoning, and the curtain closes. However, that's not to say that Sato's journey is over. Rather, he's just taken the next step, which is the most important thing anyone can do. After all, if meaning comes from sharing one's experiences, the good and the bad, even that doesn't matter if you don't, whether that be because you don't try in the first place, or you give up. Which is what Sato did by becoming hikikomori and removing any and all human connection. He gave up, overwhelmed by his failures, however those failures only remained for as long as he didn't try to surmount them. It's the same as relapse, because even if you feel like a failure, you can't be one if you pick yourself back up and decide to try again. And in that sense, it's impossible to escape the N.H.K, because as life goes by, we'll keep making mistakes and keep chasing goals. That's just how the human psyche works, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. In service of this, I find the title of the final episode to be a perfect encapsulation of what the anime has to say. Giving a look at the episodes, it's not hard to see the pattern in which the titles are created. Welcome to the project, welcome to fantasy, etc., etc., as if each episode is welcoming Sato, or the audience, to experience something. However, the final episode is a bit different in that it will be the final welcoming, and hence the place where one is intended to stay afterwards. As such, the title granted to the final episode is Welcome to the N.H.K, because we're going to be stuck here for the rest of our lives. However, we're also stuck together, and so we can lend a helping hand. After all, whenever Sato needed it, Yamazaki was always there for him. So then, the final thing I want to say is that no matter how lost you feel, or how much a failure you think you are, the last thing that anyone that cares about you wants is for you to give up. Thanks for watching. Now go and get a slice of your own life.